Jodi, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. So with that report being handed down today, what are you expecting?
Well, the report is being presented to the Premier. We hope that it's going to be released today. We haven't obviously received confirmation of that, but I think, you heard Fred's story. Many people are still impacted enormously by this. There were more than 900 people who contracted COVID-19, 22 people died, and there were more than 2,700 people on that vessel. So thousands of people, I think, are eagerly awaiting this, and I hope the Premier does release that report publicly today.
Who or what is the subject of your ire at the moment, Jodi? Is it more the New South Wales Health Department, or is it the federal departments that were involved in this?
Well, I think it's disappointing that Scott Morrison didn't allow those federal authorities to give evidence at this inquiry. But this inquiry was incredibly important in understanding what went wrong so that it never happens again. The fact was that we were in the middle of a pandemic, and somehow those 2,700 passengers were allowed to disembark that vessel on the 19th of March, despite the fact that there were unwell people on that vessel and there were swabs where the results were yet to be known. It comes, I think, in regard to the kind of chain of responsibility from the protocol to the testing to the quarantine. But obviously we believe that New South Wales Health should not have allowed those people to disembark that vessel.
The federal government did send written submissions, though. Is that sufficient?
No, I don't believe it is, because I think, these thousands of people caught up in this need to hear from all agencies involved. We've got the cruise ship operator, we've got the Port Authority, we've got New South Wales Health, of course we had Border Force, we had biosecurity involved. There were lots of agencies and people who were responsible for this decision-making. I think that, those people who were involved deserve this. This was one of the, most significant public health episodes that we've ever had here in New South Wales, and we need to make sure this never ever happens again. There were mistakes made, and we pushed for this special commission of inquiry. This is not about necessarily blaming different agencies, it's about understanding who was responsible and ensuring this never ever happens again.
The Premier did move quite quickly on this inquiry. Do you concede, and obviously do, that it was the right thing to do?
It was the right thing to do, but she didn't move quickly on this at all. Originally, she announced a police investigation, a criminal investigation, and that wasn't going to get to the heart of protocols being breached or inadequate. So this special commission of inquiry, we spent 2 weeks, almost 3 weeks, in fact, lobbying for this so that there was evidence given in public, and those responsible were called before the inquiry. You may remember as well that this was quite rushed, because the vessel itself was being forced to leave the Illawarra, so Port Kembla, and there were just 3 days, 2 or 3 days, where the ship's doctor and those on board, the crew, were in fact able to give evidence. So it should have happened earlier, and I do believe that this was rushed in the beginning, but I think Brett Walker has done a terrific job in being able to get this report so quickly, because we're in a second wave now. Obviously, we don't have the vessels coming into the harbour, but New South Wales Health knew this was an issue in February. The New South Wales Government knew this was a problem, that this could happen. And despite knowing that, there were obviously a breakdown in the protocols between the different agencies. And we had so many people who suffered. We have to remember as well that, we need to take ourselves back to March. So we're at the height of the pandemic, but this is largely at that point confined to Sydney. What this did was it took it to regional New South Wales as well. So we had people from the North Coast to the South Coast who then were diagnosed with COVID-19. We also had people who travelled interstate, and we had people who got on planes and went overseas. So this had enormous ramifications during that first wave of the pandemic.
Well, I'm not sure whether you've caught the report this morning that suggested that pilots, airline pilots, were worried about passengers disembarking from the Ruby Princess, and Border Force weren't able to provide passenger logs because pilots didn't want those passengers on board the plane, which is another development this morning. And Fred kind of referred to this as well in our previous interview. He was worried about getting on the ship in the first place. So what's your biggest point of contention here, Jodi? Is it that the passengers were allowed off, or that they were allowed on?
Yeah, that's actually a good point that Fred raises, because on the 8th of March, New South Wales Health rated the vessel as a medium risk, but people were still allowed to get on the vessel and the vessel was still allowed to disembark, still allowed to leave. The fact is that by the 19th it had been downgraded to a lower risk, which is just extraordinary how we ended up from medium on the 8th to a low risk to public health on the 18th, 19th. So it came in on the 18th very, very late in the evening, and then passengers left very, very quickly. I mean, the people who were on that vessel will tell you that they're so surprised at how quickly they were made to disembark that vessel. So what was great about this inquiry is it wasn't just about the 18th, 19th events. It was, in fact, about the 8th, which is when passengers got on that vessel. And I don't know if you remember, but there was one report that as soon as they announced over the PA that they were leaving, the passengers cheered, because there was some concern that they weren't allowed to leave the harbour. But, you know, there are many questions I hope will be answered today, and we need to make sure that this never, ever happens again. We're very happy that this inquiry happened. We pushed for it publicly for a very long time, and eventually the Premier had to succumb to those requests.
No one's lost their job over this yet. Do you believe that heads should roll?
Well, we were very critical of Health Minister Brad Hazzard at the time. I think, you know, he didn't appear before the inquiry. It was the bureaucrats only. I think the bureaucrats were operating under very, very difficult circumstances. But this will, I think, possibly not land on blame around individuals, but around agencies. I mean, Brad Hazzard, one of the comments he made back then was that, oh, I don't know anything about the Ruby Princess. Well, he's the Health Minister. The buck stops with him when it comes to his agency. So, you know, let's see what happens today. We're keeping an open mind in terms of our response, but I do think it's important, as I said, that we get to the bottom of what happened for people like Fred. I've spoken to many passengers, many families who obviously lost people they love and cherish on board that vessel, and the impact is everlasting. That's you know, that's what we're faced with now.
All right.